we're good now. Okay, so I guess that's okay.
There you go. Okay, cool. Thanks.
It should be able to do page down.
Yeah, it's called a slide.
Oh,
there we go.
Page up,
page,
so page up and page down.
oh, page up and page down.
Page up, page down will do it.
Okay, all
And if
right.
you need the big lights, so they can hold this up so everybody can see it better.
Yeah, I will. So if you're going to build a replica of Isaac Newton's telescope, you have to decide what telescope you're going to build, because in fact there are 3 telescopes associated with Isaac Newton, plus there's one in the collection of the Royal Society in London. So basically what I naively did is I looked at, I Googled the images for Isaac Newton's telescope, and an image like that one showed up, which in fact is the image of what's in the collection of the Royal Society. My replica I made as a Christmas present for my wife, and again I just copied it from pictures that I found on Google, and also from pictures of replicas that other amateurs have made. And I tried to make it look brand new, not in its current distress condition. So here it is right here. Just in the flesh here. It's life-size too. It was a really tiny telescope. It's not like a model. It's the full size. Here's some other replicas, commercial replicas you can buy with varying degrees of quality, from the cheap plastic Gauquin on the left all the way to the Astro Engineering one on the right, which is, I copied a lot of my telescope for the Astro Engineering replica because they had a movie of it and you could see it from all sides. So a little history behind the telescope. Isaac Newton invented the Newtonian reflector, but he didn't really invent the reflecting telescope. There are other people at the time who had ideas about how to make a telescope with a mirror. But he was the first person that we know of that actually built a reflecting telescope. He did that in 1668. He wasn't too happy with it, so he built a second one. And word got around, this was before he was really famous. And word got around about the second telescope that he made, and he was invited to show it to the Royal Society in 1772. It was shown to King Charles II, and everybody was really impressed, so they made him a fellow of the Royal Society on the basis of that telescope. What we actually know about that instrument can be found from a written description by a guy named Henry Oldenburg, who was the secretary of the Royal Society, and he wrote up a detailed description of the telescope along with a diagram I'm going to show you here in a second. They sent this material off to Christian Huygens in Holland for the purpose of establishing a priority of invention. So he could be properly named the inventor of that type of reflecting telescope. Now, Newton presented this telescope to the Royal Society, and it is supposedly this telescope that is currently in the collection of the Royal Society. In fact, if you go to their web page here, they say down here, they have a picture of that telescope. And they say, object history, Isaac Newton built his first reflecting telescope in 1668. This is the second model. But to call this telescope the second model is sort of having a rather elastic interpretation of the truth of the matter. In fact, it's not really the case, as we'll see here in a second. This is a diagram of his first telescope in his papers, Newton's papers that are in Cambridge University, and they found this, and we think that it's the first telescope that he wasn't very satisfied with. This is the second telescope, and this is a sketch made by Henry Oldenburg. So we know that the second telescope presented to the Royal Society in 1672 was this telescope, and it looks quite a bit different than what's actually in the Royal Society now, which is similar to my replica here. For instance, there's 2 bands that hold the optical tube. Here there's 3 bands. This is a short and stubby telescope. This is much longer focal length. And so clearly this differs from what the Royal Society claims is Newton's second telescope in their collection. Newton actually had a hand in a third telescope that was made by his roommate, but he was sort of made under Newton's supervision. And his roommate was John Wickens, and John Wickens eventually left Trinity College. And some scholars believe that Newton kept that telescope after Wickens left, and it was supposedly the best of the 3 telescopes. So there's 3 telescopes so far, and then plus the Royal Society telescope. So let's look at what the second telescope is like. It had a 2-inch primary mirror made of speculum metal, so it wasn't a glass mirror. They didn't have the technology for that back then. So it was essentially a very shiny piece of metal that was figured as a spherical concave reflector. And it had a focal length of only 6 1/3 inches, which gave it a focal ratio of 3.2, so a very, very fast telescope. And that combined with the spherically figured mirror created a pretty horrendous spherical aberration, which is a problem with this telescope too. It had a secondary mirror also made of speculum metal, and it didn't have an eyepiece. It just had a little plano-convex lens that was sort of inserted into the side of the optical tube. In order to attempt to minimize that spherical aberration, a small lead diaphragm was actually put over the eye lens with a little hole punched into it, and that sort of stopped down the rays coming from the spherical reflector and sort of eliminated the rays that were coming from the edge of the mirror and sort of made the spherical aberration a little less, minimize that. So just quick comparison between Newton's second telescope, the telescope presently in the Royal Society collection that is claimed to be the second telescope, and my replica. I didn't try to make mirrors out of speculum metal or anything like that, although the Astro Engineering replica is actually, has metallic mirrors. I just used ordinary glass mirrors that were pretty close to the specification of the second telescope. And I ended up having a focal ratio pretty close to the Royal Society telescope, which is the one I was trying to copy, and a magnification that was actually more closer to Newton's original telescope. Some material comparisons. I tried to use the same materials Newton made, or at least the same materials that are in the telescope that is in the current Royal Society collection. Used the same kind of woods for the stand and so forth. The only wood that I kind of cheated on was the mirror cell back here. I made this out of cherry instead of cocos wood because I couldn't find cocos wood, but apparently they look similar. Apparently all the metal bits were made out of wrought iron on the Royal Society telescope. These brass bands, I made the brass bands because the Astro Engineering replica had brass bands, and I thought, hey, that's pretty cool, and the guy must know what he's doing. But the more I researched that, the more I realized that these bands were probably made of wrought iron, not brass. So I think it looks nicer, and sue me if I'm not accurate or whatever, but I'm going to keep them. They're a present to my wife, and I wanted it to look pretty. So the second telescope was presented in 1672, but it was last seen in 1718. The first telescope was acquired by these instrument makers, Heath and Wing, and so we know that because it was seen in their shop prior to 1737. And in 1767, a representative from these same instrument makers actually presented the telescope that this is a copy of to the Royal Society, and they affixed a plaque to it that said, "The first reflecting telescope invented by Sir Isaac Newton, made with his own hands in the year 1671. Well, that plaque contains a contradiction, because it was the second telescope that was presented to the Royal Society in 1672. That's the 1671 telescope. And it says that's the first reflecting telescope, which was actually made in 1668, some years prior. So there's a contradiction in that plaque. So the real story, according to scholars, is apparently this, although there's a lot of speculation. It appears that Heath and Wing rebuilt Newton's second telescope, copying that Oldenburg drawing and description I showed you. It turns out that the third telescope that Newton made with Wickens, Newton was trying to clean the mirror of that telescope. It got badly tarnished. It's a mirror made out of metal. And he ruined the mirror in trying to clean it. We know that because he writes about that in Optics. So what scholars think is they had all these bits and pieces laying around, Heath and Wing, and they kind of made this Frankenstein telescope with as much of bits and pieces that were crafted by Newton as possible, and then they just sort of filled in the rest with stuff that they made themselves. So that primary mirror was probably the mirror from the third telescope, and they reground it to give it actually a longer focal length than the focal length we know the third telescope had. We think this is true because we know that Newton used silver in the alloy for the second telescope, the one that was presented to the Royal Society. But metallurgical analysis of the mirror in the telescope that's currently in the Royal Society collection shows that there's no silver in it. And we know that he didn't use silver in the third telescope mirror, so that's probably where that came from. They probably used some metal work from the first telescope, maybe the third telescope as well. We know that the first telescope was in possession of Heath and Wing, and we also know that Edmund Halley probably came into possession of the third telescope, and he probably gave the third telescope to Heath and Wing. They were kind of all mutual friends of one another. The wooden parts were probably made by Heath and Wing. That's this little ball socket and this little stand and stuff like that. And certainly the mirror cell, because the mirror cell has a degree of craftsmanship that indicates tools. The tools that made it were not available in Newton's time. So what's really in the Royal Society collection is kind of a Frankenstein telescope made with various parts from Newton's telescope, and also some parts they made themselves. Now this is something that's very curious. Can you turn the lights on real quick? I'll show you this. In the telescope that's currently in the Royal Society, there's a big hole right there that's plugged with a cork. And this is where I decided, no, I'm going to draw the line here. I'm not going to give my wife a Christmas present as a funky hole with a cork in it. So I merely suggested this with a circular pattern in the decoupage here. But the real Royal Society telescope has this big ugly cork in there. And scholars think that this is because the tube was from one of Newton's telescopes, maybe the third one. And this is at the correct position for the focal length known for Newton's telescopes. And so what Heath and Wing did was, when they redid the mirror for a longer focal length, they just plugged that hole with a cork. They drilled a new hole up here where the current eyepiece is. And then they just tried to make a functioning telescope with that. I have a problem with that hypothesis because that would mean that when Newton made his telescope, he had this much body tube extending, or this much optical tube extending beyond the eyepiece area. And why would he do that? And the only explanation or hypothesis that scholars have made on this regard was that he had the extra length of tube as a sunshade for terrestrial viewing. Well, a Newtonian telescope inverts the image. Why would you want to use it for terrestrial viewing anyway? So it strikes me as being kind of an absurd explanation for the cork in the hole, but nobody, in fact, really knows. So finally, just my replica. I used glass mirrors, as I said before, to try and make a somewhat usable telescope. I didn't really put a cork in there. I just kind of suggested it with a pattern in the decoupage. It does suffer from a rather severe spherical aberration. I'm currently experimenting with diaphragms to put over the eyepiece with little pinholes in them, just like Newton used, to try and stop it down and produce a better image. And if you're interested in knowing more about this, I highly recommend these two articles that are from the notes of the record of the Royal Society, and they go into some detail about the provenance of the telescope that's currently in the collection of the Royal Society. That's it.
Very good.